Okay, so as many of you know, we are in the middle of possibly the greatest economic downturn that will probably, or at least in high likelihood, will eventually end up surpassing the Great Depression. The Great Depression's unemployment rate at its peak was around 24, almost one out of every four people, 24.9%. And then some people, yeah, was it the Missouri Fed? Can't remember. They were projecting numbers of 30%. 3 out of every 10 people be unemployed. And we're looking at last week's or this week's unemployment numbers, and those were in the 3.3 million range. And if you compare this to the 2008 unemployment numbers and maybe the graph of unemployment up till now, I mean, you look at the shocks, you look at the magnitude of the graph with respect to that, and it dwarfs it completely. It's like as if the 2008 recession said, "Hey, look, see how bad it was now," and the epidemic said, "Here, hold my beer. Let me show what I can do." So, and the reason why our economy is tanked again is because people have to shelter in place. Because if we don't shelter in place, we can't flatten the curve. If we don't flatten the curve, we can't prevent the overrun of our hospitals. And there, if you're even familiar with what's going on in the New York City metro area right now, our hospitals are getting like ransacked with respect to their resources and healthcare workers. They're running at surge capacity already, and they're effectively ready to move into something even worse. So, but even then, that's not the worst it could be, and that's why we're all social distancing. That's why we're all sheltering in place effectively so that we can flatten the curve, so we can prevent our healthcare system literally from like crashing into the ground. So because of that, that's why we have these stark unemployment record, economic downturn numbers. And so some people have been saying, well, how do we get past this? Well, now you have some of these crazies on the right saying, and Trump being the lead of it, saying, hey, look, let's go back to church on Easter and let's celebrate. Let's celebrate that that we can get our economy back on track. And you have to remember that flattening the curve does not give us a cure. It just prevents our hospitals from getting overrun. Like, until we have some sort of like at scale prophylactic drug, which just means a preventative, or not preventative, excuse me, but something that can actively combat the virus, and or a vaccine, flattening the curve is literally just a means of buying us time to find one of those two things that will work. Or the long-term like perspective is to just find herd immunity, where 60 to 70% of the population has it, so the transmission of the virus is just not as severe as it is now, effectively limiting the what's the term, R0, meaning the rate of contagion to literally around 1, which means that for every person who gets it, how many people do they infect? And if they if that R is greater than 1, then by definition, the growth of the people who catch the virus is going to be exponential by definition. And so keeping that number near 1 is key. So we need either prophylactic, vaccine, or herd immunity. Herd immunity, not going to happen. And if we go the herd immunity route without any other measures, we will literally end up killing, at least in the United States, somewhere in the 2.2 million people range. I mean, particularly because COVID, if we had a healthcare system that could actually handle everybody being sick, you would end up maybe having the number I think is a 1% death rate, 1 out of every 100 people who catch it. Okay, but if you don't have a hospital system that can take care of it, all the folks who go close to critical, you can't take care of them because you don't have enough ventilators, you don't have enough staff, you you have to put in all of these triage type measures that basically give the ventilators to the people who have the highest chance of living. So if you're on the wrong end of that spectrum, you're dead. And that causes those numbers to rise. And this doesn't count the amount of people who would get care for non-COVID stuff that would go into the hospital system, but because they're not being treated, they either will, number one, catch COVID, or two, not be able to be treated for the stuff that they're suffering from, and they end up dying too, because those resources are being assigned to folks who are dying from COVID. So, okay, so we need a prophylactic or a vaccine. Prophylactic. There's some drugs on the market that have been kind of fast-tracked by the FDA. One interesting one I heard in particular was that you'd have basically injections directly into your system that prevent your immune system from overreacting to the virus. And that hyperimmuno responses end up what kills you. It's called a cytokine storm, if that's how you say it. And so these drugs have been fast-tracked through the market, and hopefully those will produce something. Jesus, please help us with that. The other is a vaccine. For a large-scale vaccine to go through, usually those vaccines take at least, and this is like a super optimistic number, 12 months minimum. Okay, 12 months minimum. So we're looking at this for the long haul. Meanwhile, back at the White House, you have folks like Trump and some of these other crazy right-wingers who are saying, hey, look, we can get back into work. Let's go back to work because you know what? That's what's good. That's what's going to fast-track our economy. And so this is something that we really need to talk through. Sorry about that. So what have people been saying on this front? Like, when do we restart the economy? I'm reading from the Real Clear Politics article about this on Monday, and it says Texas Lieutenant Governor Patrick said on Fox News Monday night that, quote, lots of, unquote, grandparents might be willing to die from the coronavirus in order to save their grandchildren from living through another Great Depression. Quote, my message is that let's get back to work. Let's get back to living. Let's be smart about it, unquote, Patrick said on Fox News. Quote, and those of us who are 70 plus will take care of ourselves, but don't sacrifice the country. I just think there are lots of grandparents out there in this country like me. I have 6 grandchildren. That's what we all care about. And I want to live smart and see through this. But I don't want the whole country to be sacrificed, and that's what I see. No one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in, Patrick told FNC's Tucker Carlson. There are so many things wrong with this. Number one, where's the data? This is just some broad sweeping statement. Now, I think the sentiment is there. Surely. But that's a Pyrrhic trade. It's a Faustian trade. You would ask a grandparent, would they be willing to sacrifice their lives for their kids and their grandkids? They would say yes. But what kind of question is that to ask somebody? Because, number two, I thought Republicans and conservatives were the party of family values and life. I thought we cared about people. I thought you cared about families. And so the bargain that you're telling people is that they should be willing to walk into a biological minefield and risk getting killed? Like, is that something they need to do? Like, is that a value that these conservatives are holding up as okay? What? And I think the biggest argument again is that who gives a rat's ass about the economy if our loved ones die? Like, it is just astounding how people will literally be saying, you know what, grandma ain't all that. I think it's more important that our economy starts up. And I think this should really bother anybody who calls themselves a Christian. I'm a Christian progressive. That's how I self-identify. And I think what has so ravaged our country, and this is for both left and right, neoliberal, centrist, and neocon military, like war hawks, they talk about economics and economics as this sort of like rule of law, kind of like this law of nature that just somehow can't be transcended. I find it astonishing that so many like Christians who I would normally say, I really respect this person as somebody who's trying to follow Jesus the best way they can. And then they give me these sort of twisted arguments about how capitalism is, which is, okay, let's be clear. I think there's a difference between capitalism, free market, like rapacious capitalism, predatory capitalism, versus a meritorious system of rewarding people for working hard and being able to produce things in a manner better than other people. There's a fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is that when you're talking about the type of capitalism, exploitative capitalism, that so many Christians seem to laud, it seems to go directly against the sort of thing that Jesus would talk about. It makes no sense, particularly when you look at the whole of the Bible as the God who is watching out for this small little nation, this little do-nothing low nation. I'm not saying that to be diminutive or to talk ill of the Hebrew people in the Bible. They literally are a small little nation amongst economic and military giants of their time. This is why the Old Testament is such a significant theological work with respect to talking about power, because God is clearly not on the side of the Seleucids, the Persians, Abyssinians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. He's not on their side. He's on the side of the small little nation who is, at least from the perspective of the Hebrew Scriptures, when they talk about for a lot of Jews, and again, I want to be clear, I'm a Christian, so I don't want to speak for folks, but from what I understand, the reason why the Exodus is such a big deal is because God is watching out for this small little, like powerless nation who has been chosen by God, and he works for them against one of the most powerful empires that was known to humankind at the time. That was the Egyptians. Okay? So the type of God that we're looking at in Scripture is not just this sort of God that is kind of looking at our physical and economic and social and even maybe political circumstances and going, meh, just believe in me. No, he's looking with compassion. He's looking with care. He's looking with mercy. And he's looking with the eyes of justice. He's not just kind of turning a blind eye to it. You even hear it in the beginning of the book of Exodus. The Israelites cried out, and the Lord God heard them. I hope I'm getting it somewhat right, but that's the effect that the reader needs to have when they're reading the beginning of Exodus. They go, God hears people who are suffering, okay? And so when you're looking at a system like capitalism, the very way it paints people from a modus operandi standpoint is that it's as, what's his name? Nick Hanauer from Pitchfork Economics. He talks about how we have effectively painted the human being as completely the persona of how modern economics has painted people, what he calls homo. I don't even know how he would say it. I'm not sure it's an even word, but it's his way of saying it's called homo economicus. I think that's how he calls it. Homo economicus, which is basically painting people as super greedy, ultra selfish, will do anything and everything in their own self-interest all the time. And he basically says, if you constantly paint people in that light, you are painting people as completely like psychopathic. But that is that's the underpinning. That is literally the underpinning of so much of economic thought, that humans are so selfish that they will not look in the interest of others. And so Nick Hanauer in his podcast, he fights this notion like a bunch, and he says, hey, maybe humans are a little bit more collaborative and cooperative than you think, because in having some of those characteristics, that there's a benefit to how society works. We have to remember that economics is not physics. It's not chemistry. There are not laws of nature that necessarily, by definition, govern economics. Economics is not a mathematical science at its core. It is a philosophy of what we believe, or what a person believes, how the world works with respect to human nature and the way we congregate around systems of commerce and interaction and resource building. It's a social science with, yes, a bunch of math involved, but it's not the lowest level of what forms the basis of economic thought. It is your perception and your understanding of how humans interact with each other, especially, and if you're talking about macroeconomics, how we interact at scale. So the reason I talk all about this is because we have kind of put it into our minds that because economics sounds a certain way, or that this must be what has to occur, that somehow economics is somehow undeniable, that is irrefutable, that a particular economic school of thought is just the way, the quote-unquote, the way the world works. And that is absolutely wrong, because it is a theory, not one necessarily proven by quote-unquote the scientific method, but one that is based on presumptions and assumptions about human behavior that are not necessarily true and have to be constantly tested and retested. So when you're looking at this, when you look at something like this where somebody says, let's sacrifice people for the economy, the real question becomes, why do we have to? Like, what is our economy really based on? Is it based on, and this is where we start getting into really interesting things like, what are the real metrics of economics? What is the goal of economics? Is it merely just to describe growth in this sort of like really cold mathematical way? The primary metric that I'm thinking about is the GDP, gross domestic product. How much are we producing? Another one is the stock market, the NASDAQ and the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Like, why are those the necessary metrics of economics? Because again, economics is a social science. And I would, as a Christian, assert that there are moral assumptions that are built in by that. And the interesting thing is, I think so many Christians have just given up and just said, hey, look, these are just laws of nature. No, you don't have to do that. And particularly when it comes to issues of economics, Christians cannot cede moral ground. So many Christians just somehow look at economics as sort of, well, that's just the way it is. No, it doesn't have to be. It does not. Particularly, and I'm going to talk about this over and over again, if you subscribe at all to modern monetary theory. Because, in short, and I don't want to go into it too much in detail, there's a lot of other resources in the web. You should listen to Stephanie Kelton ad nauseum about this. But the bottom line is, because we are a country that runs on a fiat currency that is dispensed at the sole discretion of the U.S. government, whose funding in dollars can be appropriated by the government by congressional law towards building out real resources, we can pay for stuff. See, what MMT, at least for me as a Christian, kind of points out is that the real issue isn't limits. There are limits, but the limit in MMT is not. It's not. Are we going to become insolvent because we're gonna basically be paying for things that we're going to go into debt, and we're going to basically not be able to pay back our debts. That's not it. The real deal is being careful about not to create inflation risk. Is to deal with inflation risk, to make sure that we don't inflate the dollar unnecessarily because we're pumping money into. We're spending into an economy that cannot provide real resources at the rate by which we're infusing money and infusing funding into the economy, creating a supply side shock. No, the issue is not if we are going to go into debt. The issue is inflation, which I think is the real issue. But it gets constantly that point always seems to get put down because the question that always seems to get put up by both Democrats and Republicans is, how are we going to pay for it? As if that is some magical law. But because so many of those folks have been indoctrinated into the school of economics that cannot get past the idea that our economics is not necessarily built on this notion that we are completely limited by funding. Government can pay for it because it has a fiat currency dispensed at the sole discretion of the U.S. government. There is none of this pay for argument anymore. When you understand that, you understand that we can quote unquote pay for things. The reason why we don't, and it's from now not an economic perspective, it's a moral perspective. It's that we do not have the political will to do it. It's because either we are blind or we are unwilling to do it. Now, in this economy where we are clearly going to fall into the type of depression that is going to cut people off at the knees, we need, as I may have said in some other video, we need an economic defibrillator. The kind of stuff that we are trying to do now is just not good enough, because there's no point in supplying money later on to the working people of this country if they don't get defibrillated now. There won't be a living soul with respect to the working class and to folks who are poor in this country if they don't get defibrillated now. They're going to lose their jobs. They're losing their jobs. They're going to lose their homes because they won't be able to pay rent or their mortgage. They're not going to be able to feed their kids. They're going to be out on the street because they've lost their homes. They can't make their car payments, so they lose their cars. Their cars are going to get repo. They effectively won't be able to travel to work, and that awful cycle will continue. You need to think about that as the moral reason why you cannot let economics get in the way, because economics here is not the problem, or at least the economics that you think supposedly run our country do not have to exist. Darn you, Milton Friedman, for infusing our country with this poisonous economic propaganda that we can't pay for stuff. We can. And so that should be our economic plan. Keep people in place. Get them to stay indoors. Flatten the curve. And in the meantime, fund our hospitals. Fund PPE and ventilators for them, and support for their staff, so they can continue to function and be able to scale out the operation such that they don't get completely overwhelmed. Find ways to ramp up any healthcare worker so that they can help deal with the COVID virus, where you're dealing with whether you have registered nurses, PAs, other sort of therapists, mental health care professionals, folks who can actually help doctors alongside of this. I saw a doctor I follow on Twitter, his name's Eugene Gu. He's saying, look, we do not have time for hierarchy anymore. It's all hands on deck. People got to be able to deal with this and be able to handle it now. There is no sort of well, I'm a doctor and I could do this thing on my... No, mobilize them. And the way you do it is you get the federal government to get start paying for stuff. We need an economic defibrillator. And then for the people who have been laid off, as I heard Kelton say, they stay home because it's their job to stay home. Because if they stay home, their job's to save lives, and they save lives by staying home. So you pay them to stay home. That's it. That's the economic plan. That's the plan that you use to save America. Not send grandmothers and grandparents back out into the workforce to die because they don't need to. And anybody who tells you otherwise doesn't understand economics and does not have a moral fiber in their body.